This is a photo of George Grosz and John Hartfield from 1920 holding a poster that reads, "Die Kunst ist tot," or in English, "Art is dead." The two were members of the Berlin Dada group, a part of the ongoing avant-garde movement engulfing Europe in the early 20th century, which sought to advance art and culture into a new realm, which left traditional Western values by the wayside. Dada, in particular, is known as one of the most pugnaciously political of all the avant-garde movements, unmistakably characterized by radical leftist thought. But though art historians would have you think that this is just another revolutionary art movement in a long line of liberal artists who just wanted to try something new and stick it to the establishment, their aim was not to change art. Their aim was to replace it. Art is Dead was not expressing lament at the state of art as we might today. It was a declaration of victory. Art is dead and we killed it. On purpose. As they themselves put it, the concepts of art and artist are an invention of the bourgeoisie, and their position in the state can only be on the side of those who rule. And if such radical upheaval was their declared aim, it's safe to say that from our vantage, the avant-garde pulled that off. It's undeniable that what is called art nowadays is simply not the same as what art was in the past. And if we're honest with ourselves, I think we can understand that there is an undeniable difference between what is and what was. But for many of us, I don't think we quite understand why. Hasn't art always been about liberal ideas of free expression and the exploration of the human psyche? Don't artists have to be free spirits with open minds? Well, if that's the case, why do we instinctively understand that somewhere, at some point, art became different, became modern? You can thank our institutions both for the expectation that the average person would affirm that fine arts, poetry, theater, and other expressive facets of culture are fundamentally liberal, if not agree that said cultural pillars are unimportant and boring. But if art is liberal, why did these liberal revolutionaries want to kill art? With what enmity would they hold an institution which permitted free expression and openness? When you actually explore the history of art, you begin to understand that the avant-garde was waging war on art itself. But we can't dive into the history just yet until we do a little defining. When questioning why and how and when art changed, we must first ask, what even is art? Well, if anything, it's important. The shifts in art and culture have always been microcosms of the overall shifts in society. Art is a magnifying glass to the heart of humanity. And while art may seem to change with the times, in a lot of cases, it's actually the other way around. Art imitates life, which imitates art. To properly understand politics, the decisions regarding how a society is governed, you have to understand that politics are downstream from culture. But that's not the whole picture. Politics are downstream from culture, but culture is defined by art. And art, at its core, is a form of worship. Art is the glorification of that which an artist values, the observation of how that artist sees the world, and imitative of what God that artist bows to. This worldview, one which characterizes what people value, is informative of how said people will decide how to run things. A society which believes murder to be morally reprehensible will make it condemnable no matter how they are governed. Politics don't inform morality. Morality, or often lack thereof, is what informs politics. Art is not only the visible manifestation of that morality, but often the impetus for reinforcing or changing morality. Likewise, a people who depict visceral and open sexuality in their art are going to support legal systems which allow for the pursuit of those ideas. The social precedent set by art and culture is always more informative about what a people believe and how a people behave than what is codified in law. The difference, as we will come to understand, is between the tradition of art which glorified God and art which glorified rebellion to God. From the ancients up until the early modern era, art reflected subservience to God. Although there were many ancient works by pagan artists, cultures like Greece or Rome made art that did not violate many of the moral and biological precedents set by God. They still honored a power greater than themselves and the value in virtue. That's not to say that there weren't a lot of flaws in their culture, but much of it unknowingly acknowledges God's design. Such commonalities were essential in the conversion of many of these Gentile cultures. But of course, the most beautiful and important works of art and culture were the ones that reflected the Creator directly. The whole reason that we humans make art is because we are made in the image of an artist. The first thing ever established about the character of God was that he is the creator. In the beginning, God created. He is the artist, and art has always existed in congruence with God's design. Conversely, what you see now is nothing but the degradation of these natural values and the elevation of what select few revolutionaries have decided is better. As Satan rebelled against God's design, they rebel against what humanity has always known to be true about the world God created. Christian artists create in reflection of the Creator. Modernists and liberals destroy in reflection of the destroyer. By elevating subjectivity and chaos, it intentionally deconstructs social precedents and completely disregards all that came before. Art has always been characterized by values derivative of fundamental truth and are therefore entirely illiberal. Conservative values of order, hierarchy, balance, and harmony define art. Or at least, they did while art was still living. Liberalism is a cancer, and somewhere along the way, art became ill. And I think if we take a look at the history, we may be able to pinpoint exactly how all of this went down. And I'll try to be as concise as possible, focusing on the philosophical implications rather than all the little minute details, but we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to have to simplify a lot. But the rules are that even if you want to break it up in parts, you have to watch all the way through to hear my full assessment. So without further ado, this is the story of how liberalism killed art. For all of history prior to modernism, art in the West was a tradition. It was not homogeneous, nor was it entirely enclosed. But as art grew out of disparate primitive practices, a continuity began to form. Though this continuity grew and changed throughout the centuries, it was self-referential. Every new art movement either built upon or returned to what came before. Though different movements had different inspirations, radical departures or intentional deconstruction, which questioned fundamental presuppositions about the world, were not present in art. The styles may have changed, but the intent was largely the same. From the time of the ancients, art always embodied order, composition, purpose, and imitation, and the worship and reflection of a higher power. Though the ancient Israelites glorified God and the Egyptians or Babylonians glorified their own false gods, everything they created was very obviously and objectively glorious. Trabeated architecture is not only structurally viable, but grand, imposing, and visually understandable. Ornamentation, detail, and the use of precious materials all communicate power, status, and craftsmanship. You don't need an overpaid museum art critic approaching menopause to explain to you how it makes sense that a large base and several tapered columns can hold up a smaller entablature, or that a big pyramid of bricks is awe-inspiring to look at. It all makes sense innately, because it appeals to natural law. Natural law, of course, being the way that God made things. Everything was under a certain hierarchy, and everything had purpose. Over time, as culture refined, art shifted from less functional to more visual. But again, the intent remained the same. As cultures like the ancient Greeks refined from their archaic periods to their classical and Hellenistic periods, the austerity and excellence of art solidified, and the human interest in the accurate representation of reality became more apparent. The development of naturalism, the precise and realistic replication of natural forms, embodies this desire to know and understand the human body. The Grecians and the Romans who followed after got rather skilled at depicting the human form through sculpture, but translating those 3D forms to 2D space of painting and drawing proved more challenging. That's not to say they didn't try, and though they couldn't quite crack it, their attempts underscore the developing interest in what would become illusionism, the practice of creating the illusion of 3D space within a 2D plane, thus expanding and creating an extension of our world. This act of creating is all an imitation of the God and Creator who made the world we inhabit. But the Roman development of these practices would largely be lost at the fall of the Roman Empire as Europe transitioned to the medieval period beginning in the 5th century AD. Though illusionary techniques developed scarcely little during this time, important precedents were set that would affect the rest of art history, namely the advent and widespread popularity of Christianity. The periods of medieval art were defined not only by Byzantine, Gothic, and Romanesque styles, but they established the importance of biblical subjects and themes in art moving forward. Truthfully, these biblical themes resonate with people more than any others. Just take a look at our most popular stories today. Though God's story wasn't widely accessible in written form at the time, art became used during this era as an educational and inspirational tool. It not only glorified God, but it taught others about God. It was out of the Middle Ages that this essential through line became so prominent and cemented in the heart of the Western artistic tradition. Out of that heart grew the Renaissance, a rediscovery of the Greco-Roman artistic techniques, writing, and history, which was still centered around the Christian themes established in the medieval period. These Greco-Roman innovations would be essential in informing the development of naturalism and illusionism during the 15th and 16th centuries. Artists like Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and Raphael implemented those techniques into beautiful and inspiring works which brought biblical and mythological subjects to life. The discovery and implementation of linear perspective, as well as other key illusionary techniques like foreshortening and chiaroscuro, were crucial to these developments. Now man was finally able to realize that aspiration to create a 3D space on a 2D plane. The desire of the Renaissance thinkers to discover, dissect, and depict different facets of the known world drove them to pursue further groundbreaking studies in mathematics, human anatomy, and physics. This further study, of course, is what gave way to the scientific revolution. Originally, sciences and humanities were ways to discover God's hand in creation. But as we will see, this delving into the depth of scientific thought began setting a foreboding precedent, especially in the wedge it formed between the arts and sciences and the church. That's not to say that the two parties are incompatible, that's far from the case. Much of the art of the Renaissance was commissioned by the church, and a lot of the related study was spurred by these commissions. Even the Old Testament is abundantly clear that God has a glorious and exacting standard for art and architecture, whether it be the tabernacle or the lavish bronze sculptures adorning Solomon's temple. The root of this problem between the church and the humanities came in the clashing pride of clergymen who held to man-made superstition, or the pride of the scientists who felt more enlightened from their own discoveries. But the fruits of this growing divide could not be seen quite yet, and as the Renaissance progressed, it gave way to the Baroque in the 17th century. A more lavish and exaggerated form of Renaissance art, the Baroque was still in keeping with its core tenets of exploring human form, depicting mythological and biblical scenes, and innovating on new styles and techniques. Artists like Caravaggio employed an extreme stage-like chiaroscuro called tenebrism to bring biblical stories to a more dramatic level than what was seen before. The Baroque also introduced more decorative sculptural pieces and more expressive geometrical forms than the rectilinearity of Greco-Roman classics. Even more lavish and decorated was the Rococo, a French development which, like the Baroque styles it grew from, pushed illusionism to its limits, blurring the lines between real and unreal. Additionally, the Rococo pushed the geometric developments of the Baroque further into more organic and even asymmetrical territory. But for a lot of people, this lavishness grew to an unbearable level, which seemed an affront to the simplicity and starkness of the classics. This growing disdain for the Baroque and its derivations came most often from two schools of thought: the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment. Many, but not all, Protestants took issue with the Baroque, a specifically Catholic style, because of its frequent use of iconography and statuary depicting Christ, saints, and other heavenly beings. They believed such depictions were being posed as objects of worship, thus violating God's commandment against idolatry and graven images. Just as the Catholics vandalized and destroyed many classical works in the name of iconoclasm, many Protestants did the same for converted Baroque churches. The second factor in the reduction of the Baroque movement came from the growing 17th century philosophy of the Enlightenment. Work of the scientific revolution by the likes of Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and John Locke inspired many to reconsider the established Western attitudes toward God and man. Obviously, there's a lot more to the Enlightenment, and it's not one unified movement, but its effect on art and culture can be summarized as the elevation of science, pure reason, rationalism, and egalitarianism over the traditions of God, the church, monarchy, and order. Tradition saw man as a created being which existed to serve God and live within the specific role God had designed. The Enlightenment saw man as an existing being who could self-determine purpose simply by appealing to a universal rational truth. The Enlightenment man was not created for a specific purpose, but rather he was a tabula rasa, a blank slate. That's not to say that reason, logic, and science are mutually exclusive to religion. The key difference that we must understand is that before the Enlightenment, it was generally agreed upon that reason and logic were subordinate to God's sovereignty. God, being the perfect and divine creator, lorded over man and moved in often inexplicable and irrational ways. Logic, science, and reason were tools not to explain God fully, but to explore the world around us, and they could only function based on presupposed God-given truths. They were means, not ends. Initially, many Enlightenment thinkers accepted a view which still saw God as sovereign, while still elevating ideas of liberty and humanism. Resultantly, a more rational view begot a less lavish and adorned art style, neoclassicism, a return to the more strict adaptations of the Greco-Roman and Renaissance traditions. Many argued that the Baroque and Rococo styles were unnatural, and that returning to the simplicity of nature as represented by the original classics was more adherent to God's natural design. The scientific development of precise archaeology, particularly in the investigation of the volcanically preserved cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, aided in the replication and study of these classical forms. In painting, the neoclassical style manifested in a more stringent and stripped-down depiction of subjects from mythology and the Bible, preferring a matter-of-factness to the drama of the Baroque and Rococo. However, even though some interpreted Enlightenment writings in a way which still revered God and tradition, there were others who placed reason, logic, and science above God. This inversion of God's authority posed reason to be sufficient for man's philosophy and religion, necessitating that tradition must be rewritten entirely. These ideas marked a key shift from submission to God to a humanist mindset which valued individual liberty instead of the collective unity of servitude to God. This, of course, inspired both the American and French revolutions in the late 18th century. But the key difference between the two lies in the former's reverence for God and the latter's forsaking of him. You see, even though the effect that the Enlightenment had on Western culture ultimately fueled godlessness and humanism, many of its key thinkers and practitioners were devout Christians, like the American Founding Fathers. Many of the Founding Fathers still believed in structure and hierarchy and the need for the populace to be obedient to God. They didn't believe in pure freedom, but rather the liberty for one to pursue God unhindered. In their minds, the obedience to God and the leadership of natural aristocracy was required in order for a democratic system to operate in the first place. The same cannot be said of the French Revolution, which deposed both the authority of the monarchy and the Catholic Church, sending themselves into a tumultuous and bloody spiral of revolutions and counter-revolutions even into the 19th century. Cults like the cult of pure reason and of the supreme being showcase just how quickly the French people were willing to forsake God for the worship of their own inventions. This rebellious spirit of the French Revolution, which discarded God and tradition entirely, is the exact same destructive and satanic spirit which formed liberalism in the Enlightenment. And that spirit would fester in European art and culture until European art and culture was consumed by it. But this was merely the beginning of the end. The rise of Napoleon and the establishment of his French Empire brought neoclassicism back to the forefront of French art. Napoleon also established the French Academy of Fine Art in Paris, which was an institution for upholding certain standards of art. This authority would establish Paris as the center of Western art and culture, and establish the Academy as the ultimate arbiter for what was acceptable. Outside of France, other anti-Enlightenment thinkers like Edmund Burke, a Protestant statesman in the British Parliament, helped redefine standards of art and conservatism moving forward. His writings condemned the regicide in France and appealed to the classical and conservative attitudes of God and authority. Even more influential were his writings on taste and on the sublime and beautiful, which outlined that there are natural, innate, objective, and God-given standards for what we consider awe-inspiring and pleasurable to the eye. Despite what the Enlightenment thinkers may tell you, these ideas aren't up for debate in the marketplace of ideas. They are objective, and they are inscribed onto the human heart. But though the chaos of the Age of Revolution seemed to subside, a new threat to Western values began to rear its ugly head. The continued innovations and discoveries from the scientific revolution had contributed to newer and more efficient methods of production, culminating in the start of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century. Artisanship, family trades, and workshops would begin to be replaced with factories. Craftsmanship would be usurped by mass production, and the unity of the natural world and traditional cities would erode in the wake of the industrial city. Up until this point, the layout of European cities still reflected medieval times with winding narrow streets and unorganized urban layouts. Now, not only did streets become wider, straighter, and more rationalized to accommodate horse-drawn carts, but also the creation of new roads into major cities opened the floodgates for foreign migration. Factories overtook the skyline and consumed natural landscapes, and new materials like iron and steel began transforming how cities were constructed. The French revolutionists and their successors championed these innovations in the working class, seeing the Industrial Revolution as a means to advance the working class to bring about the utopian rebirth they desired for Europe. But many others saw the Industrial Revolution for what it was, an overbearing revolt against nature whose consequences would be disastrous for humanity. Many artists and writers sought to return to an appreciation of nature, wishing to conserve and steward God's creation without such harsh exploitation. Many of these ideas manifested in Romanticism, the 18th and 19th century movement in which both European and American artists depicted a vibrancy and liveliness absent in neoclassicism. and a reactionary reverence for nature in the face of industrialization. Influenced by the works of Burke, the Romantics reflected on God through the sublime character of nature, returning to a former humility absent in Enlightenment and industrialized thinking. And at this point in the 19th century, the Parisian Academy still remained the authority on Western art. Their salons where art would be showcased were run by a jury who only accepted quality neoclassical or romantic works depicting stories from the Bible, history, mythology, or allegory. Anything outside that subject matter that did not meet their quality standards was rejected. And this level of gatekeeping provided stability and order to art after the tumult of the French revolutions. But this was only plugging the dam. The creation of liberal ideologies during the Enlightenment had already begun to take root in the West. The spirit of rebellion and destruction had already manifested in the Enlightenment shift from authority of God to the authority of reason. The industrialist shift from valuing the immaterial to valuing the material, and the French Revolution's replacement of hierarchical order with egalitarian chaos. This is the heart of liberalism, pure and perpetual rebellion. Though the Academy could be overbearing and prudish, rebellion from foundational norms often requires intrusive authority. But the application of such authority would only increase the pressure. Though select subsequent art movements would, in some form, uphold the traditions set by classical and Christian art, the scales had been permanently offset. Very soon, the dam would no longer hold, giving way to a deluge of modernism that would kill art for good. And it all started with Impressionism. As deviations continued to proliferate among the Parisian art scene, the salon juries continued to reject the work of a particular gang of artists that would come to be known as Impressionists. Led by Jacob Abraham Camille Pissarro, artists like Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and Edgar Degas continually rejected the naturalism of the academic art styles, favoring forms and colors that were criticized as unfinished impressions of reality. Their subject matter involved everyday life, underscoring the movement's humanist and urbanist perspectives, which contrasted starkly with the Academy's standard of idealism, tradition, and a truth higher than the individual. The mundane nature of their subject matter may not seem so terrible at first, and many of their paintings are nice to look at. But the elevation of the ordinary always devalues the extraordinary. Not only were their subjects nothing special, but their materials were as well. Paint at the time was most often done on large canvases with oil paints which the artist had to make himself. But due to the manufacturing processes made possible by the Industrial Revolution, paint was becoming widely available, pre-made in tubes. All of this may not seem so scandalous now, but the people at the time understood their rebellious intentions quite well. Of course, none of it would matter if they couldn't show their art, and though they were continually rejected by the official salon, they were able to organize an alternative, the Salon of Rejected Works. However, this concession on the part of the French government would set a dangerous precedent going forward. Once you start making exceptions to the rules begin to break down. And that's exactly what began to happen. You give them an inch and they take a mile, and the preceding post-impressionists like Vincent van Gogh, Georges Seurat, Paul Cézanne, and Paul Gauguin continued pushing the envelope, using increasingly non-naturalistic forms and colors. In particular, they began breaking linear perspective in favor of showing multiple perspectives at once, underscoring the descent into subjectivity and unreality. Paul Gauguin himself grew less fond of Europe altogether, abandoning the continent to live and work in Tahiti. His expatriation and absorption into this primitive pagan culture, including having sex with the underage tribal girls, transformed and devolved his art. As we will come to see, the introduction of these tribal, spiritual influences and their own styles of abstraction would further fuel the departure from the natural traditions of art history. And at this point, the paradigms which characterize modern art had started making their way into the main salon as well. The growing prevalence of leftist working-class idolatry influenced realism, a movement with the naturalism of classical works, but with a subject matter derivative of urban humanism. In reaction to this, symbolism brought a much more spiritual perspective to naturalistic painting, but with a much more twisted quality than Romantic or neoclassical works. Even the Art Nouveau folded in pre-Raphaelite early Renaissance styles, but with a strange occult elevation of female sexuality. Amidst this confused unraveling of society, and forever marred by changing industrialized cities and liberal ideologies, the ship of Western culture was rocking. But it was only upon the unholy birth of the avant-garde that she would truly start to tip. Aptly named after the advance guard in the French military, the avant-garde movements denote the last phase in the assault on art. The doctor says it's not looking good, and the tumor of liberalism is in its final stage. No longer were the Impressionists simply existing alongside traditional art in their alternative salons. They needed to push further. They needed art, beauty, and objectivity to die once and for all. Fauvism, a word descriptive of wild beasts, came to describe the evolution of Impressionism into an even more abstract form, depicting strange sexual lust and garish, divisionist strokes of color. While true art expressed praise to God, this expressed only the depraved self. The movement so named Expressionism came to define much of the European avant-garde, depicting strange and harrowing emotions resultant of the misery of modern life, dark sexual forms, and subjective abstract nonsense. Imported artifacts at ethnographic museums inspired the adoption of tribal and primitive ritualism. Though Gauguin had to travel to be enveloped in these dark arts, their transport into the heart of the European civilization helped embed these forms into the avant-garde. Unlike times past, where cultural diffusion and the rate of change occurred slowly and in such a manner where new ideas could be carefully assessed, industrialized travel and the importing of foreign cultures through ethnography and immigration led to a much higher rate of cultural change and ultimately a much more rapid rate of decline. This infestation of degenerate and dark ritualism corroded the norms which held up Western society. Delusional ideas about spirituality, sexual deviancy, and feminism incubated in the minds of these artists until they were released upon the public. Besides the demonic voodoo influences, occult practices like theosophy, an esoteric universalist religion described as the theology of women's liberation, and anthroposophy, spiritual discovery through sensual experience, led to the widespread use of drugs, orgies, and seances to access spiritual gateways to inspire these corrosive cultural practices. One such practitioner of both theosophy and anthroposophy was that of Hilma af Klint. Her non-objective work was widely unrecognized, but retrospectively declared ahead of its time, considering a similarity to the abstract expressionism that we'll see later. But truthfully, these similarities only go to show the satanic spirit organizing all of this. Some woman in the 1900s painting stuff more similar to the 1950s than her contemporaries is not just a coincidence, considering how she practiced seances, dressed androgynously, and spent her adult life painting garbage abstractions with egg tempera while her own eggs shriveled in her ovum. It's all demonic, and it's all an affront to beauty, objectivity, and natural law. And if all of this wasn't bad enough, guess what? It only gets worse, because Picasso saw those voodoo masks and thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I furthered this cultural degradation by making art completely devoid of Western standards and glorifying ugliness and chaos? And that's exactly what he went and did. But you would think that garbage like Les Demoiselles d'Avignon would be simply too far. I mean, in less than 20 years, we've gone from blue haystacks to blue nude, and you think that that would be enough for people to shut down this avant-garde nonsense for good. And while Picasso's work was scandalous, the avant-garde had already embedded itself, not only with its alternative salons, but also with the help of art collectors. Though initially quite rebellious, institutional power would quickly swoop in and prop up these ideas, astroturfing and supporting them inorganically. Collectors like Gertrude Stein and Solomon Guggenheim, son-in-law of Victor Henry Rothschild, used their wealth to purchase, display, and fund the production of copious avant-garde works. The avant-garde was the weeds growing up in the garden of European art and culture, and these people, these benefactors' donations, were the fertilizer. So despite the shock that Expressionism and now Cubism brought to Europe, it was already too late. And that momentum wasn't just isolated to Paris, but the avant-garde seed spread all over Europe. In Italy, the spread of industrialization and the abstract cubist artwork pioneered by Picasso inspired Futurism. Italian Futurism worshipped technology and sought to completely eradicate old ways of thinking, even if that meant violent upheaval. Development of the avant-garde in Russia coincided with the Bolshevik Revolution, resulting in constructivism. Like synthetic cubism before it, constructivism incorporated non-traditional materials, creating an amalgam of meaningless forms and shapes. It not only rejected decorative stylization in favor of pure abstraction, but also more intentionally used art for the purpose of political propaganda like never before. And this, in turn, inspired the most avant-garde of all avant-garde movements, Dada. At the outbreak of World War I, many avant-gardists were either drafted or fled to other countries like Switzerland or the US. It was in this distance from the war and the increasing instability of Europe that Dada would mutate the avant-garde into the total erasure of reality in favor of madness. Like the name would suggest, Dada is just pure nonsense. It's ugliness, chaos, disorder, and the worst aspects of industrial modernity simply for the sake of being so. I mean, Duchamp quite literally signed a toilet and called it art. And despite occurring over a century ago, Dada and the culture of interwar Europe and the Weimar Republic look closer to our modern day than anything. Every standard that could be questioned or challenged was cut up into pieces, sometimes quite literally. These standards, they believed, were the very cause of the devastation brought about by World War I. And because that was the case, they declared that everything had to be demolished. We would begin again after the tabula rasa. Where have you heard that one before? This manifested in rampant sexual degeneracy, androgyny, transvestitism, and other depraved ideas and behaviors which became the baseline for this movement. And just like the surrealist movement which followed after, nothing was based in reality. Reverence, piety, and beauty were no longer celebrated. All the flowers in the garden were suffocated and overtaken by brambles and weeds and thorns. And just as Gross and Hartfield said, art was dead. Well, mostly. And there's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. You see, there were still some people with higher standards who actually had something to say about all this. There was even this one painter from Austria who held an exhibition called Degenerate Art, where he rounded up all the abstract nonsense and put it to shame. But this increasing pushback led many abstractionists and their benefactors to flee to the United States at the outbreak of World War II. Outside of European abstractionism, America actually still retained some semblance of an artistic tradition. Up until this point, all the avant-garde movements were exclusively from Europe. While some of it had made its way over here in places like New York, the American regionalist art movement, occurring at the same time, still preserved a specific cultural identity. It was far from the most traditional, and while the effects of urbanism and realist cynicism characterized much of the movement, American regional paintings were a far cry from the cultural degradation occurring in Europe. But this tradition and the old American identity would not remain intact through World War II. Though the US emerged victorious from the war and a new wave of nostalgia for tradition swept the nation, the government and those people who fled Europe during the war had other plans in mind. The US establishment wanted to create a new and uniquely American cultural identity which competed with European abstractionism. Instead of Norman Rockwell or Edward Hopper, the CIA spent millions of dollars creating, commissioning, and promoting abstract expressionism. Like German expressionist works like those of Vasily Kandinsky and the unidentifiable and relatively unknown work of Hilma af Klint, AbX moved the still warm corpse of art from abstraction and solidly into non-objectivity. While abstraction is the exaggeration or disregard of real-life features of a subject, non-objective work has no subject but itself. Works by Jackson Pollock, Martha Rothkowitz, and other members of the New York School all created large, non-objective works which, despite seeming meaningless, are all described as having an innate spiritual quality to them. That's possibly because spiritual rituals, sensory depravity, and drugs were used to create their works just like the avant-garde before them, and such access to spiritual communication just goes to show that abstraction is really just a symptom of demonic possession. It's all godless, and compared to regionalism, the work was wildly unpopular at the time. But thanks to collectors like Peggy Guggenheim, daughter of the aforementioned Solomon Guggenheim, along with her husband, the surrealist Max Ernst, and the full support and funding of the CIA, abstract expressionism eventually embedded itself as the premier art movement in America. And this was the final nail in the coffin for art. From now on, not only would art continue its downward spiral, but the counterculture would become the status quo, and the institutions would be in full support of these once rebellious ideas. Like the Dadaists after World War I, the institutions believed conservative values to be responsible for World War II. Objective standards, masculinity, and subservience to God were all too threatening to democracy and needed to be eradicated. And that's not a secret, they literally wrote a handbook on it. And the reason that they spent so much money promoting abstract expressionism is that they understood both how art defines culture and how art was always founded on conservative principles. You take away the Jenga blocks at the bottom and the whole tower falls down. You change art from glorifying the magnificence of God and the beauty of His creation. You take away all standards of objectivity. You muffle the natural law innately known to all people, and you elevate nonsense, degeneracy, and subjectivity, and you end up with a culture and society that has no idea who it is, where it came from, or how to get anywhere besides where it is now. When people see a de Kooning sell at an auction for hundreds of millions of dollars, they like to scoff and claim that it's all just money laundering and that no one actually cares about that. Well, yeah, I have no doubt that art collection involves money laundering, but the elite care about this stuff because it's their religion. Beyonce and Jay-Z own an exclusive never-before-seen Basquiat painting for the same reason that his stuff is on t-shirts at Gap. It's because Basquiat is the neo-expressionist gay black messiah, and they need everyone to think his satanic chicken shit is cool. This is what the powers that be worship, because it's how they got where they are, and they need the populace to not challenge it so that we stay right where we are. Because despite the liberal hold over institutional power in the world, they understand correctly that they are still the ones in rebellion against the natural order of things. They are still the anomaly. All they have to do to stay in power is convince you otherwise. If you want our culture to keep spinning its tires in the mud in the middle of a rock slide, keep thinking that this, or this, or this is art, and that saying it's not is like racist or something. Unless, of course, you care about art, and you, like me, are tired of the BS that's been propped up by our institutions for the last 70 years. Our culture is not going to change until our art changes. We cannot return to our identity being one nation under God when we are currently no nation with no identity, unified only under our collective pursuit of our own destruction. We need to stand up and speak out against abstraction, industrialism, humanism, and enlightenment thinking. We need to condemn what's fake and begin redefining what art is and isn't. And most importantly, we need to start making good art and media. If we want our nation to glorify God again, we need to inspire that return through our culture. And that starts with each and every one of us. Just as art is worship, let everything you do be worship. Forsake the post-enlightenment individualist programming and seek meaning and truths higher than yourself. And whether you're an artist or not, seek that the work of your hands would express your love and worship of the hands that made you. They may have tried to kill art, but they can't kill its source, nor can they erase the echoing examples laid out by our forefathers. Though their modern paradigms may loom large in front of our faces, we have thousands of years and innate natural law to draw from. They may think that they killed art, but so long as art is the worship of all that is good and godly, art will never die. And as for me, I'm ready to see it return more glorious than ever.